Today we are replacing the clutch master cylinder in our Del Sol, which I'm going to show you where that is. Here's the reservoir for the fluid, and then if you just come right behind it, right down there is the master cylinder, and it goes through to the clutch pedal on the other side. So we're going to start by loosening up the bolts or removing the bolts that hold the reservoir in place right here, these two bolts. That way we can kind of move this out of the way. These are 10mm bolts. Here's a socket head. This won't fit on that one under there right now because this connector's in the way. So I'm just going to show you how to remove that. There's a little plastic tab on the underside of it. Just push that tab away from you, and then you can slide this entire piece off of its bracket right here. With this connector out of the way, you have a little more room, but this metal tab is still going to block the head of this bolt a little bit. So if you just loosen up this bolt over here on the end, that will give you enough play to just kind of work this tab over to the side so that you can get a socket head onto that bolt. Once those bolts are out, you can just tuck the reservoir out of the way. Obviously make sure the cap's on super tight. Put some rags or some towels underneath this hard line right there where you can see I have that open wrench connected. That's a 10mm little nut that you need to break loose. Don't disconnect it all the way. Just make sure that you're able to loosen it. Once you're inside the car, start with your clutch pedal, go up the arm, and you'll see the master cylinder going through the firewall. There are two 12mm bolts, one here and one on the other side of the cylinder. And you'll also see at the top here there is a little pin coming through, and there's a cotter pin locking that into place. So we're going to unlock this cotter pin first. Pull the cotter pin out. Once the cotter pin is out, which by the way is no easy task with this cramped workspace, this little pin right here you just slide out, pull out from the other side, and then you'll be able to take this loose. I just want to show you how difficult this nut is to reach on the far side of the clutch pedal here. You need to use I have to use a deep socket with a extension on it to get any chance of working this in here in this little tight space to work on this final nut holding the cylinder in place. We're now back on the other side of the firewall, and now we're going to go ahead and undo this nut on the hard line, which will allow the master cylinder to come out. Again, make sure you have something here to catch fluid that is probably going to leak out of this line. Once the hard line is disconnected, you should be able to work this out. You might have to use a pry bar or flathead to get under there. Try to save this little gasket. You're going to reuse that. Or if you have a new one, fantastic. Here's the old cylinder. Here's the new one side by side. You will want to just check the length right here and make any adjustments necessary on the new one with this nut, just so that you have the same kind of take-up point that you had in your old clutch, because you're probably used to that. Then all we're going to do is use some pliers, squeeze this line clip right here, and move the move the reservoir from the old master cylinder to the new one. Of course, I'm gonna do this upside down so that I don't leak a whole bunch of fluid right now. I've transferred the line from the old cylinder to the new one and moved that rubber firewall gasket that was around here, and you can see I just reinstalled it over here, and now we're ready to put everything back into the car. Before you reinstall, this might be a good time to go ahead and clean out the inside of your clutch fluid reservoir in case there's any grime like mine has built up. Once you have the master cylinder and the bolts threaded back through the firewall, go ahead and just hand tighten the nut right here, the line nut on the hard line. You want to have some play here to do that, so don't tighten up those other bolts, just make sure they're fed through. Then you can hand tighten and maybe give a couple of turns with the wrench just to make sure you're not cross-threaded before we go back to the other side. Here on the inside of the car, when you're reassembling, you're going to want to insert the pin at the top of the clutch pedal first before you try to do the bolts. So you might have to push your clutch pedal in a little bit just to make the holes line up. But do that first and put the cotter pin back in, or at least, sorry, use a new cotter pin. Once you have the cotter pin installed, which by the way is very difficult to do just because of the cramped workspace, you then have the benefit of being able to just use the pedal to pull the bolts through and keep it up in this position as you thread the 12mm nuts, which you should have saved from before, back into place to hold everything together. Before we reattach everything, we need to do a little bit of kind of a preload of fluid into this new master cylinder. You're not going to be able to do a regular bleed from the slave cylinder because it's just too far away from the master in this car, and also there's just too much air in the system. You're not going to get any effective bleed from the other end. So what you're going to do is just make sure that that hard line is just barely installed. You want to make sure that there's some air that can get in, or rather get out, through that little outlet right there. Next, just reinstall this one bolt just to keep this reservoir from tipping over. Remember, you're still going to need to set this aside later so we can get back to the hardline nut to tighten it back up. And we're just going to fill this with our .3 fluid and leave the cap off. You'll come back inside the car and you'll, with your hand, just pump the clutch pedal, hold it down for maybe 2 seconds, and then slowly bring it back up. Good. You'll then come back to the reservoir and check to see that the level's gone down a little bit, and you're going to keep checking the connection where your hard line is to see if any fluid has made it all the way to there. If it has, then hopefully you've gotten most of the air out of the cylinder itself and it's got fluid in it instead. At this point, replace the cap on the cylinder, remove that bolt, that one bolt that's holding this in place, and we're going to, again, set this to the side so we can re-tighten up the hard line down here. I cleaned up these 2 bolts for the clutch fluid reservoir, and we're going to just go ahead and reattach those 2 right now. Once you have these 2 bolts reattached, make sure you replace this gray connector right here and tighten back down this bolt, which you probably had loosened to move some of this out of the way. We can now remove this cap and proceed with a regular one-man bleed procedure from the slave cylinder, which is down up here by the radiator. And you can look at my video where I replaced the slave cylinder for the details on how to do this one-man bleed job down here. I just want to point out for you who are doing this bleed using the one-man bleed method, don't have a vacuum bleeder, that don't get frustrated. This is not going to be as fast as when you bled just the slave cylinder. Again, there's still a ton of air in here. There's a long distance between the master cylinder and the slave cylinder in this car, and so it might take you like 1,000 pumps by hand of the clutch before you start to see the fluid level drop again in your reservoir. But just keep at it. Once it starts to drop, it goes much faster from there. So those first like 1,000+ pumps or whatever, you feel like nothing's happening. Just keep an eye on your bleed line as you're going, and just keep track of where the where the fluid level is. And as long as you see it creeping up, even if it's slowly, you know that you are doing something. And eventually you're going to hit that inflection point, and it's just going to start going much, much faster.